Before a single cannon fired or a single warship cut across the Red Sea, power in this region was already moving with the wind. Incense drifted north toward the Mediterranean. Gold traveled west from African highlands. Spices and textiles crossed from India toward Arabian ports. And between Africa and Arabia, separated by a narrow stretch of water, stood kingdoms that understood something the wider world would only slowly grasp. Whoever controlled the Red Sea controlled the hinge between continents. Stay with this story, because by the end you will see that what is often framed as distant regional clashes were in fact calculated struggles for trade, faith, and imperial leverage across one of the most strategic corridors on Earth. Long before Europe rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the Red Sea functioned as a commercial artery linking the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean. Roman merchants had sailed these waters. Byzantine envoys had negotiated along these coasts. Arabian kingdoms thrived on incense routes, feeding temples and cities far beyond their deserts. And on the African side of that narrow sea rose the Kingdom of Aksum, a power centered in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, commanding highland agriculture, gold resources, and maritime access through ports like Adulis. Aksum was not peripheral. By the 4th century CE, it had adopted Christianity and established diplomatic ties with the Byzantine Empire. It minted its own coinage. It projected authority both inland and outward toward the sea. Its prosperity depended not only on local production, but on its ability to mediate trade between Africa, Arabia, and beyond. Across the water in southern Arabia, the Himyarite kingdom controlled vital stretches of the incense trade and coastal access points. Religious tensions and political rivalries simmered there in the early 6th century. When a Jewish Himyarite ruler persecuted Christian communities, Aksum intervened militarily around 525 CE. This was not a vague civilizational clash. It was a strategic crossing of the Red Sea by an African empire projecting force into Arabia. Aksumite forces installed a client ruler in Yemen and briefly extended African influence deep into the Arabian Peninsula. For a moment, the balance of power tilted westward across the sea. But that dominance was not uncontested. The Sasanian Empire in Persia, itself a formidable Asian power, viewed southern Arabia as too important to fall permanently under Aksumite influence. Control of Yemen meant influence over maritime trade and strategic positioning against Byzantine rivals. Around 570 CE, Sasanian forces intervened, expelling Aksumite authority and incorporating parts of Yemen into their imperial sphere. What unfolded was not Africa versus Asia in any continental sense. It was a triangular contest between Aksum, Himyar, and Persia, each maneuvering within a larger geopolitical system, shaped by trade routes and imperial ambition. Then, history shifted again. The 7th century brought the rise of Islam and the rapid expansion of the early caliphates. The Sasanian Empire collapsed. Arabian political structures transformed. The Red Sea trade network reorganized under new leadership. Ethiopia maintained diplomatic relations with early Muslim rulers, preserving a degree of autonomy even as the surrounding political map changed dramatically. Centuries later, the pattern repeated in a new form. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire captured Egypt, inheriting control over the northern Red Sea. From there, Ottoman expansion pushed southward along African coasts, seeking to dominate maritime routes linking the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. This expansion intersected directly with the Ethiopian highlands and the Adal Sultanate, which received Ottoman support in its campaigns against Ethiopia. Again, the Red Sea became a frontier. Ottoman artillery and firearms altered the military equation in the 16th century, while Portuguese naval forces entered the region from the opposite direction, attempting to break Muslim control of Indian Ocean trade. Ethiopia found itself entangled in a complex web of alliances and conflicts involving Ottoman commanders, local sultanates, and European maritime powers. Across centuries, the pattern remains consistent. The Red Sea and its surrounding lands were never isolated. They were contested because they were valuable. Gold, incense, access to pilgrimage routes, control of maritime choke points, these were the real prizes. The idea of a singular conflict between Africa and Asia dissolves under scrutiny. What emerges instead is a series of interconnected power struggles among African, Arabian, Persian, Ottoman, and later European actors, all maneuvering within the same strategic corridor, and that corridor never lost its importance. Even as global trade shifted toward Atlantic routes after European maritime expansion, the Red Sea retained geopolitical significance. It remained a bridge and a boundary, a zone where empires met and recalculated. The conflicts were not civilizational wars between continents. They were strategic contests between states that understood geography as leverage. Across 15 centuries, the wind across the Red Sea carried merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and ideas. Empires rose and fell on both shores. Trade patterns shifted, Faith spread, but the logic endured. Control the corridor, and you influence the world beyond it. When the Kingdom of Aksum loaded ships at Adulis in the early 6th century, it was not acting as a distant bystander to Arabian politics. It was entering them deliberately. The Red Sea at that moment was less a boundary than a highway, and Aksum had both the maritime capability and the political motive to cross it. Southern Arabia, particularly the Himyarite kingdom in Yemen, was not only a religious battleground, but a commercial hinge. Whoever held Yemen influenced trade flowing north toward the Mediterranean and south toward the Indian Ocean. The crisis that triggered intervention was both ideological and strategic. In the early 520s, the Himyarite ruler Yusuf du Nuwas, who had adopted Judaism, launched persecution against Christian communities in Najran. The violence resonated beyond Arabia. Aksum, a Christian kingdom with established ties to Byzantium, framed intervention as both religious protection and geopolitical necessity. Byzantine interests aligned with this move. Weakening a hostile power in southern Arabia also constrained Persian influence. Around 525 CE, Aksumite forces crossed the Red Sea and defeated the Himyarite regime. They installed a client ruler, effectively extending African political influence into Yemen. This was one of the clearest documented cases of a sub-Saharan African empire projecting sustained military power into the Arabian Peninsula. It was not symbolic contact, it was occupation and governance. For a brief period, the balance of power across the Red Sea shifted decisively toward Aksum. But Yemen was never a vacuum. The Sasanian Empire in Persia viewed southern Arabia as strategically indispensable. Persian interests in controlling maritime trade and countering Byzantine influence made Aksum's presence unacceptable. Around 570 CE, Sasanian forces intervened, defeating the Aksumite-backed regime and integrating parts of Yemen into their imperial structure. The African foothold receded, and Persian authority replaced it. This sequence reveals the real dynamic, not a continental rivalry, but a triangular struggle shaped by trade, religion, and imperial competition. Aksum's intervention was bold and effective, but it operated within a larger geopolitical system that included Persia and Byzantium as constant actors. Control of Yemen meant influence over choke points and trade arteries. It was never merely about theology. The consequences extended beyond military campaigns. These shifts in control altered diplomatic relationships, commercial routes, and regional alliances. They also positioned southern Arabia at the center of transformations that would soon reshape the entire region. By the early 7th century, the rise of Islam would dramatically reconfigure political authority in Arabia. The Sasanian Empire would collapse under Islamic expansion. Trade patterns would adjust again. Aksum itself would face internal and external pressures that gradually diminished its influence. Yet the memory of that 6th century crossing remains significant. It demonstrated that power could move both directions across the Red Sea. African empires were not confined to defensive postures. They could project force outward when strategic interests demanded it. The corridor remained contested, and new actors would soon redefine its control. When the Sasanian banners rose over parts of Yemen in the late 6th century, they did not simply mark the defeat of Aksumite authority. They signaled that the Red Sea corridor had shifted hands once again. Persia's intervention was calculated. By inserting itself into southern Arabia, the Sasanian Empire positioned itself at a maritime crossroads, linking the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean. Trade, diplomacy, and imperial rivalry converged there. But the Persian foothold would not endure for long in the form it had taken. In the early 7th century, a transformation began in western Arabia that would alter the political architecture of the entire region. The rise of Islam unified Arabian tribes under a new religious and political authority. Within decades, Islamic armies expanded outward with extraordinary speed. The Sasanian Empire, already strained by prolonged conflict with Byzantium, collapsed under the pressure. Its territories were absorbed into the emerging caliphate. Southern Arabia, once contested between Aksum and Persia, became integrated into a new Islamic political framework. This shift did not isolate Africa from the changing order. It redefined the terms of engagement. Ethiopia, heir to the legacy of Aksum, maintained diplomatic and religious ties that predated Islamic expansion. Early Islamic tradition recounts that Muslim refugees once found asylum in the Christian kingdom across the Red Sea during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, an episode remembered as the first hijrah to Abyssinia. Whether framed as diplomacy or refuge, the episode underscores that relations across the Red Sea were not defined solely by conflict. They included negotiation and coexistence. Under the early caliphates, trade routes across the Red Sea continued, though reorganized within new political boundaries. Muslim merchants expanded commercial networks, linking East Africa, Arabia, Persia, and India. Swahili. Coastal cities flourished over subsequent centuries, blending African and Islamic influences into maritime urban centers that would later connect indirectly with inland states such as Great Zimbabwe and others. The corridor endured. Its stewards changed. What had once been a triangular rivalry among Aksum, Himyar, and Persia evolved into a different balance of power under Islamic governance. Ethiopia retained autonomy in its highland strongholds, though its maritime access fluctuated as coastal dynamics shifted. The Red Sea remained economically vital, but the ideological framework around it had transformed. Centuries passed, and the region entered another phase of imperial recalibration. In 1517, the Ottoman Empire conquered Mamluk Egypt, inheriting control over the northern Red Sea. From Cairo, Ottoman authority extended southward along African coasts, seeking to consolidate maritime routes linking the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The Ottoman presence introduced new military technologies and administrative structures into the region. This expansion intersected directly with Ethiopian interests. Ottoman-backed forces supported the Adal Sultanate in its campaigns against the Ethiopian Empire during the 16th century. The Ethiopian-Adal Wars were not isolated tribal conflicts. They were entangled in a broader struggle for influence across the Red Sea basin. Firearms and artillery reshaped the battlefield. Portuguese naval intervention further complicated the equation as European maritime powers entered the Indian Ocean, seeking to disrupt Muslim trade networks. Once again, the Red Sea became an imperial frontier. Across centuries, the pattern holds: shifting empires, evolving faiths, advancing technologies, yet the geography remained constant. The narrow waters between Africa and Arabia continued to attract intervention because they controlled access between larger worlds. What began as Aksumite expansion into Yemen became, over time, a layered history of contestation, adaptation, and realignment. Each era reframed the balance of power. Each transition redefined who mediated trade and influence. And through every transformation, the corridor endured as a strategic hinge between continents. By the 16th century, the Red Sea was no longer just a commercial artery. It had become a pressure point in a rapidly globalizing world. The Ottoman Empire, having absorbed Egypt in 1517, inherited control of the northern Red Sea and quickly recognized its strategic value. This narrow body of water linked the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, and by extension, to the spice routes that fueled global commerce. To control it was to influence the flow of wealth between continents. From their base in Egypt, the Ottomans pushed southward along both Arabian and African coasts. They established footholds in present-day Sudan and Eritrea, reinforcing garrisons to secure maritime lanes and counter emerging threats. At the same time, the Ethiopian highlands remained politically independent, but increasingly encircled by shifting alliances and external pressure. The Adal Sultanate, based in the Horn of Africa, became a focal point of this tension. In the early 16th century, Adal, under the leadership of Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known in Ethiopian chronicles as Ahmad Grag, launched a sustained campaign against the Ethiopian Empire. Ottoman support in the form of firearms and military advisors strengthened Adal's offensive capabilities. Gunpowder altered the military balance dramatically. Fortified positions that once relied on traditional defenses now faced artillery and muskets. The Ethiopian Empire, confronted with this intensified assault, sought assistance from a new actor entering the Indian Ocean: Portugal. Portuguese naval expansion had opened a direct sea route around Africa, and Lisbon viewed the Red Sea and Western Indian Ocean as arenas where it could challenge Ottoman influence. Portuguese forces intervened in support of Ethiopia, bringing additional firearms and military expertise into the conflict. What unfolded was not a simplistic Africa versus Asia confrontation. It was a multi-sided geopolitical struggle involving African states, Ottoman imperial forces, and European maritime powers, each maneuvering to secure trade routes and regional dominance. The Red Sea became the connective tissue binding these rivalries together. Battles raged across the Ethiopian highlands and lowlands. Cities shifted hands, alliances formed and fractured. Ultimately, Ethiopian forces, with Portuguese assistance, defeated Ahmad Gran in 1543. The immediate existential threat receded, but the broader strategic landscape remained volatile. Ottoman positions along the coast endured in various forms, and European maritime ambitions continued expanding. Through these cycles of war and diplomacy, the Red Sea's central logic never changed. Its waters were narrow enough to cross, yet wide enough to divide. Empires rose on either shore and projected influence across it when strategic interests demanded. Trade, faith, and military technology intersected repeatedly in this corridor. By the 17th century, global trade patterns were beginning to tilt toward Atlantic routes, but the Red Sea retained regional importance. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca, regional commerce, and imperial rivalry kept the corridor relevant. Even as global power shifted westward, the geography of the Horn of Africa and Arabia remained a point of convergence. What these centuries reveal is not a binary continental conflict, but a recurring pattern of interconnected power struggles centered on geography. African kingdoms and empires were never isolated spectators. They were participants, sometimes initiators, in contests that shaped regional and global trade systems. The Red Sea did not belong to one side of a continental divide. It belonged to whoever could hold it long enough to shape the terms of exchange. By the time European powers began dominating the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in the 17th century, the Red Sea no longer sat at the absolute center of global trade, but it never became irrelevant. Its importance simply evolved. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca ensured constant movement across its waters. Regional commerce between East Africa and Arabia continued. Ottoman authority along parts of the coast endured, even as its broader empire entered periods of strain. Ethiopia remained independent in its highlands, navigating shifting external pressures without fully surrendering autonomy. What changes across these centuries is not the geography, but the actors. The Aksumites are gone. The Himyarite kingdom has vanished. The Sasanian Empire collapsed long ago. The early caliphates fragmented into successor states. The Ottomans rise and eventually recede. European maritime empires expand and then retrench. Yet the corridor between Africa and Arabia remains a hinge, strategically narrow, economically connective, politically sensitive. The idea of a singular, sustained conflict between Africa and Asia dissolves under closer examination. What emerges instead is a layered history of state-level rivalries rooted in trade control, religious alignment, and imperial competition. African polities were neither isolated nor passive. They projected power outward when advantageous, defended sovereignty when threatened, and negotiated across religious and commercial boundaries when necessary. Across 15 centuries, the Red Sea functioned less as a dividing line between continents and more as a shared arena of maneuver. Control shifted repeatedly because its value remained constant. Gold, incense, spices, pilgrimage routes, maritime access. These were the incentives that drew empires toward its shores. Even in the modern era, the same geography retains strategic weight. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait remains a choke point in global shipping. Naval forces from multiple nations patrol waters once crossed by Aksumite fleets and Ottoman vessels. The corridor continues to connect the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, shaping global trade flows. What began as Aksumite intervention in Yemen and Persian counter-expansion was not the opening act of a civilizational war. It was part of a long pattern in which African and Asian states interacted, sometimes violently, sometimes cooperatively, within a shared economic and strategic system. The Red Sea did not divide Africa from Asia. It bound them together in competition, exchange, and mutual consequence. And across centuries of shifting empires, that binding proved more durable than any single ruler or dynasty.